Hello, everyone. My name is David Gouache from the French Agricultural Technical Institute Terres Inovia. I'm very pleased to be with you virtually for this IGC2020 conference, where I will be presenting a few thoughts on how to develop grain legume production in Europe. To start off, just a few words on what Terres Inovia is. We are the Applied Research and Technology Transfer Institute of the French oilseeds and grain legumes sector. We are managed and financed by the industry, both growers and the downstream industrial sector. And financed based on a levy system that accounts for approximately 60 to 65% of our budget. And we are in charge of the collective research and development, spanning aspects both before agricultural production, so that's inputs, all the way to the first transformation of grains. And we cover basically all the key crops, whether oilseeds or grain legumes. What I'll be talking about today is trying to put a few figures on the notion of the European grain legume deficit and why we should worry about it, and give you a few thoughts on what should and could be done to reduce this deficit. So when I talk about a European grain legume deficit, what am I talking about? When we look at the figures on this data sheet here, obviously you'll find interesting figures, I think, for all the pulse crops and grain legumes in general. The most important thing we need to look at is down here, the proportion of arable land that is devoted to legume cropping. And what we can notice is that Europe is very significantly behind in terms of the amount of arable area that is cropped with grain legumes. This is obviously the fruit of, let's say, 50 years of history, both in terms of policy that have been reinforced then by a certain number of technology trajectories and massive investments that have optimized grain legume production in certain parts of the world and straw cereals production in Europe. This, however, poses a certain number of issues that I'll be getting into in the next slide. But what we can say right away, looking at these figures, is that the right amount of grain legumes that would probably need to be aimed for is somewhere between the 10 and 15% mark. This figure obviously comes from the statistics we see here and is something that all agronomists generally see, and we've seen this both in modern day balanced agricultural systems as well as in agricultural systems that are not exposed to, let's say, international competition and Ricardian optimization of cropping areas. Now, why should we worry about this grain legume deficit? On the left side here, you'll see a figure that's taken from a landmark study that I contributed to over 10 years ago now, that analyzed the phenomenon of stagnating wheat yields in Europe and in France particularly. And one of the things we found is that part of this could be incriminated to nitrogen and legume effects, and part of this could be incriminated to climate change effects. Now, when we look at both of these effects, we can actually see that about 20 to 25% of the national cereal yield loss, that equates to 2 tons per hectare lost in 2 decades. Well, about 1/5 to 1/4 of this can be directly countered by increasing grain legumes in crop rotations. And on a longer term, including grain legumes in crop rotations would significantly lower climate change because it would lower the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers that emit a very potent greenhouse gas, which is nitrous oxide, that we need to keep in mind that this one cannot be sequestered. So really the only way we can manage it is not to emit it. And that involves lowering the application of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, which is one of the key benefits, obviously, of grain legumes, since they naturally fix atmospheric nitrogen. So basically, bringing the EU back to this 10-15% benchmark for legume area would be both a short and long-term fix for some big issues in terms of the competitiveness of some major European commodities, cereals especially. Now, how can we build on this? Here are a few success factors we've seen from 27 European legume value chains that we've studied within a big European project called Leg Value. I won't go into the details, but you'll see in the figure a data analysis of basically 4 types of value chains that were defined. And a certain number of these have some characteristics that seem to be linked to a, let's say, a negative perception of all the stakeholders in the value chain compared to others that are positively viewed by the stakeholders. And if we boil it down to what can really be concluded, what we see is that the more positively perceived value chains seem to be based on a better balance along the value chain of all the stakeholders and their involvement in the project, and linked to that, more trust and especially lower information asymmetry, whether it is in economical terms, and this leads to oftentimes contracts between the different steps and the different actors in the value chain. And it also leads to intense collaboration in terms of learning in all aspects of innovation and value along the value chain. Now, why is this aspect of trust and balance important in our view in developing these legume value chains? It's because redeveloping grain legume value chains in Europe is a long and hard road, and obviously the burden of reclaiming the competitiveness of these crops in Europe is something that involves a certain level of investment and risk that needs to be shared. Now, through this slide, I'm just sharing 2 cases in France that show the amounts and let's say and the duration of investment that have been required to counter some key aspects that are limiting both pea and soy competitiveness in terms of agricultural production. So this is 20 to 30 years of breeding and hundreds of thousands of euros per year that are put into projects to allow us to lift these difficulties. Obviously, another aspect of reclaiming the significant area of grain legumes in European agriculture has to deal with on-farm economics of these crops. Now, looking at real farm accounting data in France, what we see when we take a very quick view of things is that pea is not the most economically interesting crop when it is compared to the other key crops you see in European crop rotations, wheat, barley, rapeseed. So basically, it doesn't seem to make any economical sense to put a grain legume in a crop rotation. But what we can actually see is if we take a step back and look at the economics of this at the crop rotation level, the reduced profitability that seems to arise from introducing a grain legume into the crop rotation is actually more than counterbalanced by a certain number of positive effects on the yield and nitrogen requirements of the following crop. So typically that would be a wheat crop in European rotations. And also at the rotation level, introducing such a crop and let's say the difference in terms of biology of such a crop also contributes to reducing a certain number of pest pressures that allows reduction in a certain number of pesticides, notably herbicides that we've been able to measure. So all this actually leads to what seems to be a more profitable rotation. This may not quite be enough, though, because obviously there needs to be a strong incentive to change a system that has been optimized, even though the economics in and of itself may seem to suffice. So what additional value can we create from introducing grain legumes into cropping systems in Europe? There's value, we believe, to be had in terms of ecosystem services, especially in terms of climate change mitigation. So the French government has launched, and we are developing the methodology to indeed actually add value through an official accountancy for the climate change mitigation effects of introducing grain legumes, among many other things that can be done. And at current price levels and of a ton of equivalent CO2 that is not emitted, this could lead to a 10 euro per hectare gain, again at the rotation level, going back to the same types of figures as in the previous slide. Obviously, in the same thinking, we could hope to see systems that will be able to value and give an economic value to the reduced use of pesticides and increased biodiversity. Such schemes so far have yet to be invented or developed, aside from very niche type markets and schemes. Obviously, the other part of value creation is very much in innovation, and some colleagues in the panel, I think, will be covering this pretty well. I've cited two cases in France, one with Roquette in pea protein and for food markets, and one concerning Valorex that has developed for faba bean new processes for food, for feed markets. So all this might seem nice and rosy, but it is very difficult to develop grain legumes still in Europe. And one thing we need to keep in mind, and I think especially policymakers, is that it can be very, very easy to kill a small crop or a diversification crop. And I'll illustrate this with one pulse crop, one grain legume, that is faba bean, and it's weevil that bores little holes in the grain, rendering them unmarketable for human consumption markets. And so you see the figures of development of faba bean cropping in France and how it rose steadily when France positioned itself to be an exporter for Egyptian markets. And following the withdrawal of the relevant insecticides to control the bean weevil, it has been a downhill slide for faba bean ever since then. despite, again, hundreds of thousands of euros per year in R&D being injected to try to find a solution. This is typical of a vicious cycle that is exposing Europe to increased environmental concerns that are basically caused by the fact that we have few relevant diversification crops available and that they constitute small markets. So this vicious circle is known as posing a problem of a critical transition pathway. And it's our belief that regulatory policies that are, let's say, fraught with lovely intentions of reducing agricultural environmental footprints are actually doing quite the opposite, especially when they are reducing access of producers to crop protection products when it comes to these smaller crops and especially grain legumes. So to conclude, a few take-home messages on this aspect would be to remind everyone that grain legume cropping in the EU needs to increase 7 to 8 times in terms of cropped area to reach what is a sensible worldwide benchmark. This actually does not amount to huge areas. In France, for example, this would equate to switching only 5% of the areas devoted to cereals and corn to grain legumes. So this is nowhere close to a revolution. It's just an evolution. And such a small shift would actually constitute a very big step to sustainable EU agriculture in all aspects, whether it's environmental or economical. However small this shift may seem, it is a big step for all players in the industry, because we do need to innovate technically and in terms of value chains to be able to lift up these grain legume value chains, and it requires time and collective efforts. And to do this, it's also very important that innovation for grain legumes be protected and stimulated and not thwarted by regulations, especially when it comes to crop protection or crop breeding. And with that, I'll conclude by thanking you all for your attention and thanking my colleagues at Terres Inovia and Leg Value Funding. Thank you very much for your attention.